Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and I'm joined by handsome Kyle, Dr. Tim Boswell. This is episode 121. We are back in the greenhouse, and we are talking about episode 120, which was called The Beloved. We're in the middle of season 6. Season 6 title is The Object of Our Formation. And what we're exploring is, who is Jesus? It sounds like something that's been explored quite a bit over the last 2,000 years. But you might recall that the point that Soil and Roots is attempting to address is what Dallas Willard called the great omission, that in modern Christianity, we're not particularly adept at making disciples. Part of the reason is we're confused about what a disciple means. But in Willard's words, it is an apprentice of Jesus. We've lengthened that definition a bit to include the fact that we are an apprentice of Jesus for the purpose of becoming more like him over time, primarily from the inside out. So it seems pretty straightforward that we should know who Jesus is if he's the object of our formation. We should just read the Gospels and pray and get familiar with the rest of our Bibles and go to church, and those are all very good things to do if we're trying to learn who it is that we're supposed to become more like. But if you've been listening or watching or reading Soil and Roots for any length of time, you know that we like to get a little bit deeper than sometimes what we experience in modern Christianity. So in season 6, we are looking at some characteristics of Jesus that may not just pop out at a first reading of the Bible or even through a church service. And so we've had some fun as we've dived into some aspects of our Savior that don't normally get a lot of press. And one of those is this concept of relational security. So we spent the last 3 episodes exploring what it means that Jesus is so intimately tied into his Father, that his identity is so rock solid and secure, that he seems to operate from a sense of peace, contentment, abandonment to the will of God that, at least for me, I find somewhat elusive. I don't often find myself resting in the will of God regardless of what my life circumstances are. So we thought this was worth exploring in one more episode. So guys, in episode 120, we explored relational security with God, with ourselves, with others, and with creation and culture. And we took a look at how Jesus operated or functioned in those 4 relationships. And we took a look at sometimes how we might struggle to find that same sort of relational security with God and others and ourselves and creation and culture. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more today. Tim, we're going to start with you. At the beginning of the episode, I popped in a quote, which I misattributed. The actual author of the quote is Lauren Haugen. And she basically says that when we're talking about being secure in Jesus, when we're talking about our identity being rock solid and that we are so attuned to God and others and ourselves that it really doesn't matter what people think of us. We don't strive to perform. We're not trying to win any points with people. We're simply resting in who God has made us to be. She says, the concept of belief is a little bit reduced today. We tend to think of the idea of belief only as intellectual agreement. Our mind takes in a fact. We say, I agree with that, and that becomes a truthful belief. She maintains that belief actually has 2 parts. One is intellectual agreement, and the other is that the heart has to experience it. So that our hearts don't learn simply by telling our hearts information. Our hearts learn actually through the process of going through something and concluding a truth based on that experience. So my guess is she would say in many cases in modern Christianity, which is so focused on the intellect, we have many people who are running around who intellectually hold to a set of doctrinal statements, but whose lives aren't necessarily characterized by those statements because their hearts haven't experienced that. So I just want to start there. How did that quote hit you? What's your take on the fact that belief from a biblical standpoint is not simply intellectual agreement with a statement of assertion?
The quote resonated with me strongly. I think it pretty profoundly sums up a lot of what we've been exploring over the past seasons. And it's interesting to me because it implies not just a duality of how we come to form our belief in the sense of two separate areas, right? The mind and the heart. But even in how we approach those two things, by which I mean, I think it's pretty well acknowledged in culture that our heads and our hearts are not always in alignment. You've probably heard it said, the longest distance in the world is the distance between, the head and the heart. But I think we can tend to expect that, given enough time, enough hours marinating in something, that we seem to think it would gradually work its way from our head down into the heart. Like if we go to church and hear the message long enough and are told it enough times, that eventually it will just kind of make its way down and settle into our hearts, settle into our spirits in that sense. And the quote seems to be suggesting that we need almost two separate pathways, that if we strictly take in knowledge informationally, that maybe it'll never really settle into our hearts, that these might be two different ways that we form this kind of belief through experience or through bringing in knowledge. But those are two very different ways to come to a belief. And if it's true that we need both, either simultaneously or in separate experiences, then if we just focus on one or the other, then we're getting an incomplete package. We're likely forming an incomplete belief. So that was what stuck out to me the most, is this idea that if I'm not experiencing a truth in the way that my heart needs to really absorb it, if I'm just taking it in through my mind, it doesn't matter how many times I hear it. It doesn't matter how much time I give for that knowledge to settle down and this sense of just flowing into my heart gradually. It's not going to get there, because those two separate forms of belief are formed in two different ways, if that makes sense. And maybe I'm misunderstanding, but that's kind of what I came away with.
Are you willing to share maybe an example? I mean, I've shared in my life that I trust God for my salvation, but I struggle to trust Him for my daily bread. Even though I pray for it every time I recite the Lord's Prayer, there's a sense of, I intellectually understand that God is the God of the universe and He's entirely other, and that He has no lack of resources and no lack of love. My mind's like, yeah, I get it. But when I don't think there's enough money in the bank, or when I'm struggling to, have a decent day health-wise, it's difficult for me to experience God providing for me. I sort of feel like I have to figure this all out on my own, and that there's really no help. So that's a disintegration, right, between my head and my heart. Have you thought through, is there an example like that in your own life that you'd be willing to share?
Sure. One from my own life would be this idea that as a Christian, I have access to the full power and ability of Christ, and even of the disciples. We're told that if we have faith as a mustard seed, we can speak to the mountain and cast into the sea. I've heard it said that we as Christians should be able to do the same kind of healings, that we should be able to lay hands on people and they would be well. Why aren't we able to bring people back to life? Why aren't we able to do this and that? That we should be able to walk on snakes and they bite us and we don't die, and various things. Now, some of those, of course, could be taken out of context or could be taken to be literal when perhaps they were a general principle or a point that Christ or Paul or Peter, whoever, was making. But this idea that we walk in the same power as Christ and with the same capacities that we see displayed in the disciples after Pentecost is something that I've heard many times, but I get really uncomfortable when somebody asks me to pray with them for their immediate healing. And some of that digs into the will of God versus our requests, and for the timing of God and various things. So there's many different layers to that. But my heart definitely does not settle into this same idea that I can walk on snakes and scorpions, I can speak to the mountain and cast into the sea in faith, that my faith has the same power and capacity as Christ, through Christ, despite being told that from the pulpit in various ways and formulations over the years, if that makes sense.
Cal, I'm going to ask you the same question, but if you don't use a movie reference, I'm going to be highly disappointed.
Okay.
Are you familiar with this disintegration or this disconnection where we're trained, hey, this is a scriptural belief. We intellectually agree with it, but we wake up and realize that our hearts just haven't bought in yet, because either our hearts have experienced it or something opposite to it. And so our hearts are broken, or we're just not that attuned to our hearts to recognize that there's these two sides to a genuine belief.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll open this up with a movie reference that
Here we go.
So my daughter Charlotte just turned 13, and so she is trying to take full advantage of watching as many PG-13 movies as she can. And so there's a list of things, and I'm like, well, no, this one's not, no. But then we ended up watching The Fall Guy, and with Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt. And so when he gets injured and then he kind of disappears, he knew that they had this amazing relationship. He knew that they were getting ready to go sip margaritas on the boat, on the beach. But when he got injured, he thought, well, she's not going to love me because I can't do what drew me to her. I can't be the guy who she fell in love with. So I can't possibly measure up to what she's expecting. And so I have to retreat. I have to go away. So his head knew that they had this amazing thing, but his heart was like, oh, she'll never accept you. Nope, you can't possibly have what you had before. And for me personally, that I've had to experience God showing me that kind of love, even though I didn't believe that it would happen. So, I mean, and again, I can look back on so many different instances, but I mean, it can be something as simple as like a car, right? Like if my car breaks down, there was a time when I would have gone into pity party planning mode and been like, why is this happening? I can't believe it. And I don't deserve this and all this other stuff. But then, and I'm like, and then it's, where is God? Why did this happen? Why is this? I don't need this right now. And then it would somehow get resolved, right? I mean, I'm able to drive, but it might have taken a while, or I could have been praying about it and nothing happened, or I take it into the shop and, my head is like, oh, you know what? You're going to take it in there and this guy's going to be like, you know what? I can tell that you're really struggling with this. So I'm just going to do all these repairs for free. I mean, there was a part of me that thought that, and then I would go in there and then of course that wouldn't happen. And it might even be more than what I thought it would be. And so then there's that disconnect of, well, God, I thought we were good. I thought you're looking out for me. And now why is this happening? But then I started realizing that these instances, these things that I looked at as horrible, terrible blights on my life at the moment were actually opportunities for me to grow in that trust with him. So maybe the first time it happened, since it never happened before, or I was new to it, where is God in this? But then the next time something happened, might get a recall back to that and go, oh, okay, well, you've been here before. Now, again, that doesn't mean that if my car breaks down tomorrow, I'm just like, oh, yay, it's great. I can't wait to see how closer I get to Jesus. I'm still going to struggle with that, but there's going to be a stronger foundation in that I've gone through this before. I've seen his hand in it. I've seen his provision. Even if it didn't happen the way I thought, or in a way that I never would have expected, I know he's going to be there. And so I've experienced him walking with me in these situations, which gives me more confidence when something crazy happens. And I can sort of fall back on, okay, I don't know how this is going to shake out, but I trust you and I'm going to walk with you. And okay, let's do this together.
There's a sense, first of all, your car repair stores are legendary, so I appreciate you sharing them.
Geez.
I'm not sure I've ever had a friend with as many bizarre car breakdown stories as you. So it's a great chance for you to come closer to Jesus, I guess.
Yeah. That's why I don't have a car that works, so he can keep me tethered. He's like, no. If you have another car, you're gonna wander. So
yes, Hebrews 12:11, right?
Yeah.
All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful but sorrowful. There's I've been mulling over the quote, because if we accept the premise, which is human beings are wired to come to a complete belief through a combination of intellectual agreement and heart experience, if we find a disconnection in ourselves, we say, you know what, my mind believes this, but my heart is just trailing, or my heart's been broken, or my heart's been betrayed, and it just isn't in a position to accept my intellectual belief. Are there approaches that we should be considering that would invite our hearts to experience that belief? Meaning, can we express a little bit more intentionality and say, I'm going to willingly and intentionally engage in X, Y, or Z so that my heart embraces through experience the same thing that my mind has? So, for example, I'm rereading Dallas Willard's Life Without Lack, and it's his exposition on Psalm 23. And the whole first section of the book deals with the grandeur and majesty and power and authority and inexhaustibility of God, right? And his premise is that if we sit in that, if we dwell in that, if we marinate in that, if we wonder about that, if we wrestle with that, our hearts will come to accept and rest in that truth. But it requires us to first be aware that there's a disintegration, right? I mean, we have to be willing to explore our own hearts, to dig into the deeper parts of the human person, to really determine whether or not, in that example, do we really rest in God's sufficiency? And again, this is an area where I've struggled. I intellectually agree. My heart often questions whether or not God would actually extend that provision to me, even if I intellectually agree that he has it. So, as we've been working through our own greenhouse, Kyle, there's been lots of discussions that have come up, and I've tried to press into this saying, hey, look, we all intellectually agree with X, Y, and Z, but is Jesus inviting us for the purpose of us experiencing being the beloved, right, our topic for the day, for the purpose of resting in a deeper identity with him? Is he inviting our hearts to experience a truth, and are we actually agreeing to that experience with him?
Yeah, I mean, is it similar to what I was saying about how you can look at a situation, and it, not just with a car, but anything that's frustrating or unexpected, and look at it like, okay, well, how is Jesus inviting me into a deeper relationship through this? Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily. I mean, a deeper relationship, yes, but I mean, getting specific. My heart is struggling to accept this truth. And if I kind of review my relationship with him, I can actually see him inviting me into situations that would help me to experience that. So yes, to some extent, if you continually see how God is providing for you despite your enormous amount of car repairs and expensive car repairs, that certainly would be an experience to say, hey, I can trust in God for this. What I'm asking is there even more intentionality with that we can kind of look back and see Jesus working on our hearts and inviting us into specific areas where there's a disintegration between our heart and our head?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the thing that I was thinking about was something that I struggle with mightily is insecurity and my own value and my own worth. So hearing a podcast that says the beloved and thinking of myself as the beloved was extremely, would have been much more challenging in the past. And the reason why I'm more open to embracing that is because as I look back into my story and I see all the times where I've felt inadequate or I felt unworthy or I felt, like you mentioned, Tim, just the filthy rag, the thing that God just sort of pities or loves because he's all about love, but he doesn't really just love me for who I am. I'm realizing that is all over the place. And I would love to hear, Tim, I would love to hear you speak to this too. But as I dig into my story, specifically with insecurity and my sense of value, I look back on all these different things where as I was going through them and even years after, I would think, well, I deserved that or I deserved this because I wasn't worthy. I wasn't good enough, or I failed at this because I'm not good enough. And that's why it didn't happen, or that's why I didn't achieve this or attain this, is because I just wasn't worth it. You failed because you're a failure. God's been inviting me to look back through that stuff and go, well, can you see that there was a reason why you didn't get this? Can you see me in here? Can you see me loving you and being with you and walking with you in this? At the time, absolutely not. But looking back on it, I can. And I can see what he was doing and how he was guiding me through that, even though I felt worthless and I felt less than.
Okay, so he is intentionally inviting you into an area where there's a disconnect between your head and your heart and saying, hey, look, let's go back and review the path.
Mm-hmm.
You have been beloved all the time.
Mhm.
I've been inviting you into experiencing that belovedness, and you're sort of coming to grips with that now.
Mhm.
Yeah, Tim, it strikes me. So I'll give you a very personal, maybe uncomfortable example. So, you guys have known that I've been struggling with a chronic illness for the last couple of years.
Mhm.
And it's been, not the most fun period of time, and it's been difficult mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, across the board. I've sort of come to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that I believe that God can instantly heal me.
Mhm.
He has that power. But I've also come to believe that he won't.
Mm.
And I'm not sure I'm right or wrong, and perhaps that's just a miserable lack of faith on my part. But I've sort of come to the conclusion, one, because he hasn't to this point, but two, because, at least in my life, he typically works through the mundane and slow sort of sludging through life that most people experience God in. So I fully expect to recover and to get back to full strength and full health. But I also sort of expect that it's going to be most people's journeys, which is through a lot of time and effort and money and expense and doctor's visits and protocols and blah, 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 blah. Right or wrong? Agree, disagree? Is that a disconnect between my head and my heart?
That's a tough question to tackle.
I put you on the
Because,
spot.
yeah, when we have this kind of idea that potentially conflicts with what our hearts have experienced, we experience a kind of tension, right? You might call it cognitive dissonance, you might call it internal turmoil, where we feel that maybe something should be different, but it doesn't match with what we have personally experienced. So I don't know that I would consider that a lack of faith on your part if you are still trusting that God ultimately has you. He has your back. He is with you and for you, because there might be an understanding that God can use this for good things, or perhaps he has his purposes, or perhaps it's just something that is happening because we live in a broken, fallen world, and he is going to see you through it to the other side and is waiting and ready to be present and a loving force for goodness for you, even in the midst of your suffering. And you've talked many times about the power of suffering and suffering well, which is remarkable to me. So whether there's a disconnect between your head and your heart, I think depends a lot on how you're approaching it from day to day. But it's not for me to answer. I think that's something that's a very personal level of your own faith and how you are, even through these podcasts, day by day, grappling with what God is doing or might be doing in the midst of this chronic disease.
Don't you think, though, the primary reason, I shouldn't say primary, a major reason why our hearts don't experience the belovedness that we're promised? Again, we're talking about what does it mean to be the beloved, not just know we're the beloved, but to live in the reality of being the beloved,
Mhm.
is because we have expectations or hopes that get dashed.
Mhm.
And so we read all the promises of Scripture, abiding in Jesus, resting in Jesus, come to me all who are weary because his burden is light. And there are times in our life where we're just like, this is not a light burden. I have no idea what it means to rest in Jesus. I certainly don't feel abandoned to him. And my will and God's will are continually at odds. Our hearts feel that. That's the reality they live in. Is my story that much different than yours? You've been through all these crazy car expenses. It, there would be most people who would at some point who say, I'm not sure God really likes me
Mhm.
because this feels like a punishment.
Mhm.
Or somebody who struggles with sickness, or somebody who's lost somebody and is grief stricken. To me, and I think this is where the Psalms are so helpful. But when our hearts are broken because we've experienced something that seems to be outside of the promises of God and the belovedness, it's kind of understandable that our hearts might have a hard time catching up.
Mhm.
It is understandable, but I think you're right that it's a matter of expectations. So if you asked me to form a mental image of the beloved in our family, I would probably think of our little almost 2-year-old princess, the baby sister. She's got 3 big older brothers, and she is spoiled rotten. And so a picture of the beloved might be her sitting in her little chair with her princess tiara, and she's got a little cookie in one hand and her sippy cup of milk in the other. And one of the boys is handing her a ball. The other wants to read a book to her. The other just wants to bring her some more snack. She's a little princess. That feels like the beloved. But is that necessarily what God has in mind for us? And if we're not sitting there with our sippy cup of milk in one hand and a cookie in the other, does that mean that we're no longer the beloved? What does it mean for Christ to be the beloved and still to go through everything that he did? What does it mean for Paul and Peter and John to be beloved and still to go through everything that they did? Were they not the beloved when they were suffering and martyred? So I think our expectations of what that means for us need to be adjusted, because otherwise we can look at these truly trying situations and feel like maybe God doesn't like us anymore. Maybe he doesn't love us. Maybe we're not his beloved children. Or we can look at our own reaction and fault ourselves for a lack of faith, when I believe faith takes all kinds of different forms. It takes faith to cry out to God. It takes faith to lament. It takes faith to grieve, to beat our fists against his chest. It takes faith to wrestle with God, to question, to doubt, but to stay there with him, to press into it. It doesn't always have to look like believing God will instantly take everything away. It looks like trusting that even when he doesn't, we're going to stay there. We're going to press into that relationship with him, knowing that we are still his beloved, regardless of what is going on around us.
Yeah, so you're suggesting that in order for the heart to rest in being the beloved, even when suffering occurs or things don't work out the way that we think they should, there's a deeper reality here somewhere that we need to grasp. There's a deeper experience than simply our circumstances. So what is that, and how do our hearts experience it? Because this is the root, right? Because if our hearts are going to only align with our beliefs when times are good, and it's easy to believe when things are going well. Let me use another example. So I wrote about this on Substack. I'm part of a community that studies how the brain recovers from trauma and illness, and I've been a part of this for, I don't know, a year. And the founder of the program, the community, is I think religiously unaffiliated. I'll put it that way. So she grew up in some sort of religious community, was betrayed, abandoned, manipulated, controlled. And so she has concluded that there is no such thing as absolute truth. Now, it comes out in sort of sidebar comments. And of course, that claim is very difficult to defend, because the claim that there is no absolute truth is an absolute statement. So it bends back on itself. Like, from an apologetic standpoint, if you try to claim total relativism, you've just made a non-relativistic statement, and it becomes nonsensical. And she's teaching a course that is based on absolute truth. Like, you share things that are true in order for people to reorient to what is true so that they can heal. That's the whole point of her course. So she's presenting two polar opposite perspectives at the same time. One is, I'm presenting you all these facts and truths and techniques that can help brains heal. On the other hand, I actually don't think that absolute truth exists. So she holds to the idea that absolute truth doesn't exist, not because she's thought it through, it's because her heart's been broken. So she has not yet engaged in the deeper search for truth beyond her heart's experience. And I think we all can relate to this in one way or the other. So what is the deeper experience that she is avoiding, or that I'm avoiding, or that you're avoiding, that allows our hearts to develop that rock solid trust, that alignment with our beliefs, even when life doesn't go, even when we're abused, even when we're betrayed, even when we're sick, even when we're broke? What is that we're trying to grasp that our hearts need? And are there ways to intentionally put ourselves in positions to experience it?
For me, it's been the thing that I need to keep in mind is that God's been in that with me, embracing the truth of that. And it doesn't take away from the trauma. It doesn't take away from the hurt, the heartache, the frustration, the anger. But if I can embrace the fact that he's there with me, but then that opens up a whole lot of other things, right? Like if God is with me in the abuse, why didn't he stop it?
Mm-hmm.
If God is with me in the trauma, why didn't he prevent it? He saw this was coming. Why did I have to go through that? And then that's when, like you said, Tim, like going into our heart's desires with that, with him, and being unfiltered and being like, God, what's up? Why is this? And then I think a lot of us avoid that because we're afraid that what if the answer is I wasn't there, or I don't care about you, or I don't love you. But for me, whenever I have chosen to go into that dark territory, when I've chosen to go into that dark corner, and I've been terrified to do it sometimes, he always shows up. And I know that he's there. And it doesn't mean that, now I understand and I welcome trauma and I welcome all these horrible things. No. But I do have a sense of security. And right now, speaking to you right now today, with things that are coming up and things that I know that might be coming or whatever that I can experience, I'm like, okay, I don't know how this is going to shake out, but I do have a sense of calm and stability that I didn't have before because I know that God's with me. I know that he's going to be in it, even if he doesn't prevent it, even if I have to, I know that that is going to draw me closer to him if I allow that to happen. And again, I do not want this to come across like, oh, well, you just welcome trauma and welcome all these horrible things. No. But for me, there's been a sense of stability and peace, knowing that looking back, okay, he's always been there. Even when I thought he wasn't, he's always been there. And I know he always will be there. That brings a sense of security. And at the same time, I know it might be scary, or it might be unknown, or it might be intense.
My response isn't so much about dealing with trauma, but more about going back to this idea of how do we bridge that disconnect between our heads and our hearts if we recognize it. I kind of think there's a twofold response that both you guys in various ways have already talked about. One is perception and recognition, and that is, Kyle, as you keep saying, realizing what God is already trying to do to restore that and to bridge that gap between our heads and our hearts and bring healing and unity between them. And the other, I think, is that piece of intentionality that you keep pointing at, Brian. And I'll give you an example that kind of bridges both. So some years ago, I recognized that although I knew that God was my Father, not just my creator and deity, but my heavenly Father who loved me and wanted to continue fathering me, but I didn't feel it in my heart. And I recognized that, and I felt like the Lord was revealing to me that he wanted to do that, provide that for me, but through other people, through godly men in my life. And I'm like, well, I don't really have a lot in the way of godly male friendships. And so I was out camping when this truth came. I was reading through a book by John Eldredge, and this kind of awareness came to me. And so the first step was I just prayed. I said, God, will you please help me with this? Will you help me to get this from my head to my heart? And will you bring this into my life? So the next step was perception and awareness that God was already trying to do exactly that. So the next morning I was at my campsite, and this other somewhat older man had pitched his tent during the night, and he had coffee going over a campfire, and he called me over and asked if I wanted to come join him for breakfast and coffee. And I'm an introvert, so my initial reaction was, no, I'm good. I think I'm going to go for a walk. I actually turned him down, and I started to go, off down a trail, and then, God thumped me on the back of the head, I suppose, and I suddenly realized this is exactly what I was praying for literally like 10 minutes ago. And so I'm like, all right, fine. So I went over and I had coffee with the gentleman, and we had just the best talk. And we talked about nature and God and just various things. And I just felt almost father. And I have a wonderful, wonderful earthly father, a wonderful godly man. So that's a very strong, healthy relationship. But I also felt the need for other godly men in my life. And so just recognizing it was a big step, realizing what God was already wanting to do after I asked him to do that. And then when I got home from this trip, I reached out to a man in my church that I know and admire, and I asked him to be my mentor. And we started a mentoring relationship that we've had ever since. There's that intentionality. I took a step and I reached out, and God worked through that relationship and has many times over the years since then to start to heal that in my heart and to bring that disconnect from my head to my heart, to close that gap and to provide that kind of missing piece. And now he has brought in the two of you, which have just been incredible to fulfill that yearning in my heart that I've had for years. So it was kind of, for me, just with this particular example, it was kind of a 3-step process. First, I needed to be aware of the disconnect, and I asked God to help to heal that. Second, I needed to recognize and take advantage of the opportunities that God was, like that perception you're talking about, Kyle, to see that God is already in it with me and is giving me opportunities to press into this. And then third, that intentionality that you implied, Brian, where you just need to actually create spaces for that disconnect to be addressed. And often that's going to be experiential and relational with other people, I think.
Yeah, it seems like the secret, if I can use that word, to experiencing life as the beloved is to look for and welcome what you're both referring to, which is opportunities for witness. We're back to Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of the death, I fear no evil because you are
with me.
With me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So when circumstances tend to bend our hearts away from our intellectual beliefs, it seems like isolation would only solidify that, or cynicism. And in fact, we should be on the lookout for God providing opportunities to experience him. And I think C.S. Lewis would agree this is normally through other people. Like you both have said the same thing, which is God tends to show up to solidify our heart's experiences through people. And that doesn't mean the circumstances change. Kyle's cars keep breaking down, and I keep struggling with my health, and Tim, you keep working out of a broom closet. I mean, these things are all sort of part and parcel to our lives, but there is a deeper heart opportunity, and that normally comes through community. I think this is one of the reasons why Soil and Roots is so bent on developing intimacy within groups, because that seems to be one of the ways that God delights on inviting us to experience being sons and daughters of God, being the beloved. But we have to take advantage of it. We have to be willing, to your point, lay down perhaps our introvertedness or our past hurts and wounds, and to accept the invitation that Jesus is extending through himself and other people. So that seems to be a good place to end, looking for opportunities for God to be with us, and looking back, as Kyle mentioned, through our lives and seeing how he might have invited us into those experiences before. Because my sense is, as a good father, he's probably littering us with opportunities to experience him in that witness.
Yeah.
And, in my own life, I've not always been very attuned to that. And, it's something that I think we're all trying to work on together. So good discussion today, guys. Thanks for digging into this and dealing with some pretty transparent and deep, uncomfortable questions. I appreciate your willingness to take the journey. And thanks to all of you for joining us today on Soil and Roots. This was episode 121. I'm so glad you spent this time with us. We always hope that it's helpful in your spiritual formation journey as you seek to apprentice with Jesus, that our very vulnerable, rugged, sometimes messy conversations are a help to you as you continue to explore what it means to be a deep disciple. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, you can always find it at soilandroots.org, soilandroots.org. If you'd like to financially support our work as we look to cultivate deep discipleship all over the world, you can give safely and securely at the website. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Soil and Roots Podcast, and on YouTube and Substack at just Soil and Roots. Substack continues to flourish. There's 100 and some thousand people that are following us and reading our articles over there, so we invite you certainly to check out that platform. As always, if you'd like to reach out to us and be a part of our community and to form a relationship, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at fish@soilandroots.org. And yes, we do respond personally. And as always, we enjoy learning from you and listening from you and hearing part of your backstory as we explore deep discipleship together. Today's episode was produced by Zach Fisher. He also provides our music. You can check him out at FishU on Spotify. As always, we're just so glad you're with us. Have a good week, and we'll see you next time. Hey there, welcome. Dude, you just screwed up my intro.
Finish it. Come on. You started the 11. Come on.
So OCD.
Oh, my word.
Good.
How could you just leave that hanging like that?
Because I pushed record and the countdown was on 0. That's why.